And let me start by talking a little bit about housing markets and how these markets work, and some of the challenges that we think, not just Salina, but communities like Salina up to my own face in addressing these issues. First of all, from a business perspective, housing developers and builders are really driven by two fundamental and very rational objectives. They want to maximize profit and minimize risk. You know, now there are builders and developers who, and I think most people are like this, also want to do good things for their communities. But generally, people who are in private business are not philanthropic organizations that can afford to lose money, and particularly in housing markets, they can't afford to lose money. So they want to, within the realm of social responsibility and doing good work, they want to make a profit, make a reasonable profit, and they would want to minimize the risk of losing money on that investment. So very important thing. I mean, you all know that it's an important thing to mention. Number two is that prospective homeowners have similar priorities. That is, people have two fundamental issues that they evaluate when thinking about housing choices. Number one is they want generally a safe, secure, nice house to establish a household, to raise their kids, to carry out the aspects of their life. And number two, they don't want to lose money on that house. So they tend to be, and increasingly tend to be, somewhat risk adverse. I think people have increasingly realized that in most markets, and again, the outliers are Silicon Valley and the New York City metropolitan market, and Los Angeles to some degree, where my daughter and her husband bought a moderately priced townhouse that I would consider to be outrageously expensive, but in that market is relatively moderately priced, because it's only in 6 figures instead of 7 figures, and I can't even imagine. But they'll do all right on it. So they don't want to lose. They don't want to lose money. So people don't want. They want to live in a neighborhood that is rewarding, and a house that works for them, and they also don't want to take excessive risks. The third issue is that, by and large, construction costs, the cost of actually delivering housing, is independent of where that unit or that house is being built. Materials cost what they cost. Most private builders want to make a minimum profit, and just because the surrounding values in a neighborhood are lower than they might be in another part of town, the cost of building a given square foot of house is not going to change very much. There are some economies in infill development. It takes advantage of existing infrastructure. You don't have to build new public improvements. Land may or may not be cheaper, but the cost of construction is going to be the same depending upon, no matter where it is, given that the quality of the unit is going to be the same. Number four, that the availability of financing, both for construction and for mortgage financing, is critical, and to a significant degree, that value depends on appraisals and on comparable sales. So when we, and I'm not, again, not telling any of you anything you don't already know, but it's a good way of trying to set the problem out. So if we have a house that's going to cost $150,000 to build as a moderately sized, moderately expensive house, and we put it in a neighborhood that does not have comparable demonstrable sales that are in that range, it's going to be very hard to get financing for. Many of you who have talked to us at focus groups have mentioned that problem as well. When we look at a neighborhood like North Salina, for example, where values are relatively low and where even a moderately priced house is going to be well above comparable sales in that area, it's very difficult to get financing. It doesn't mean you say, well, forget it, we can't build anything there. It just means that there are different requirements and different frameworks that we have and strategies that we have to put in place to be able to build that market. So when we approach a neighborhood development strategy, whether it's an infill strategy or a strategy on the edge, we need to keep these factors in mind. We can't we in an area that needs to have valuations built to the degree that it supports a self-sustaining housing market. It's a slow process. It is a step-by-step strategy that builds that value, which can be done, but it takes patience and money and risk and a recognition of what the private sector can and can't do that produces products that will work in specific settings. We know that the risk of building in the east part of town and in the south part of town, because the appraisals and the comparable values are going to support normal market housing, are much less than they are when we build in the northern or even the central parts of town. So what we begin to talk about is sort of a hierarchy of policies that are based on defining policy objectives that we want to see, also the ones and the outcomes that we don't want to see, and tailoring policy approaches to what should happen and to the needs of each one of those specific areas. There's another interesting problem as well, and that is that in most communities, other than communities that are building massive amounts of housing, subdivision development is not an inherently profitable thing to do. It's a thing that you have to do to be able to have lots to build houses on, but the cost of a lot plus infrastructure is not necessarily a way to make money. Private financing puts the subdivision developer at some level of personal risk and is a riskier proposition because the developer is holding that financing for a while. In markets like Salina with a population of 50,000 people, the markets are relatively slow to absorb those lots, and so the carrying costs rise and the expectation of profit on those lots increases. The theory then has been that special assessments, which are a way by which the public sector in a way shares in the cost of developing lots and provides the front-end financing to develop those lots, becomes a way of getting the necessary public improvements put in place and allows development to take place. So if we think about a series of incentives, we move from different kinds of projects that really need no help at all to types of projects where some sort of risk mediation is very helpful to getting lots and sites developed so that private builders can come in and with minimum risk develop those, to the more risky markets where we require much more concerted and deep public assistance and public policy to meet the objectives that we want to accomplish for the community, which are ultimately to make those neighborhoods self-sustaining. That if we view things that we have to do as a hierarchy or spectrum of incentives, as opposed to we're going to focus all of our resources in one place and let the private market operate all by itself in another place, we need to think about housing policy from that kind of a spectrum or continuum of actions. And I'll try to explain what that means in terms of our specific challenges. Any questions about that? It's kind of a philosophical statement that says we need to have on the edge of town, where we're talking about new development and new infrastructure, a more nuanced approach than saying yes to everything or no to everything. And when we get into areas where some of these issues of risk and reward begin to flatten out and the risk begins to be greater to both the developer and the homeowner than the reward is, we've got to recognize that as well and do things as a community if we want to see those neighborhoods develop in a sound way that provide the kind of support and ongoing predictability that assures people who are making investments in those neighborhoods that those investments will ultimately pay off and be rewarded. Does that make sense, or do you have questions about that? So now when we look at Salina and at the challenges that we have, first of all, as I mentioned before, we are not a we're not a Sunbelt city. We have the expectation of reasonable growth, but it's incremental. So if we put a subdivision down that achieves gigantic economies of scale and puts 300 lots on the market at one time, the person who was stupid enough to do that is going to go broke in a hurry if privately financed. And the city that was dumb, well, I wouldn't say dumb, the city that financed that, if it did it through special assessments, would also wind up with a lot of lots on its hands in the future. So our incrementalism is not a bad thing, but it is a challenging thing. Because we are an incremental market and people build in small chunks and they build in they want to build in demonstrated markets where they're pretty sure that the cost of development and the home price that they can deliver is going to be snapped up in the market. So you know, you don't. It's tough if you're a private builder all by yourself to go into an area where the typical market price of a house is $70,000 or $80,000 and expect to build $150,000, $200,000 houses. It can be done, but it's tough, and it requires a lot of support to make that happen, particularly at the early stages. Number three, we have a lot of conditions in Salina that tend to depress comparable property values. And you know, I could sugarcoat this, but I won't. You go around neighborhoods, and there are a lot of cases where there are a lot of great houses, and there's a nice housing stock, but there are a lot of places, particularly in the areas we want to redevelop, where houses violate codes, they're not in good shape, they might be very small, they don't comport with contemporary standards. We have a lot of work to do in those areas, and we also know that in any housing policy, we're not going to be able to accomplish everything at once. We have to chip away at it and move forward. Number 4, that as a result of a lot of things, in a lot of our neighborhoods, and this is particularly true of the neighborhood that most people really would like to see rebuilt to the greatest degree, and that's the area north of downtown. The typical value of a house is significantly lower. In fact, as we'll see in a minute, less than 60% of the cost of typical moderate small house new construction. So that is a real fundamental problem. There are a lot of reasons for this that again relate to comparable values, to the size of adjacent houses, to the lack of neighborhood services. But honestly, neighborhoods like North Salina do have significant assets as well. Nice parks, access to downtown, a neighborhood anchor like St. John's. You know, there are things there that are good possibilities. Finally, we don't have. You'll wonder what this means. We don't have the organizational infrastructure. That is, a developer who has the patience and ability to take on the risk of promoting redevelopment in undervalued or risky markets. You're not alone in that most people, when they depend on the private market alone, have real difficulty getting redevelopment to happen in neighborhoods. And as a result of that, a lot of times it takes a community effort to get that process moving. And that community effort involves an organization like a community development corporation or a variation of that called a CHODO, or Community Housing Development Organization, that has access to capital in the community that can get in, build something that maybe nobody else will build, and take the risk to demonstrate that there's value in a neighborhood. It's very hard, again, for the conventional private developer or private builder who in a place like Salina are small businesses for the most part, to be able to undertake that kind of a risk alone. They will undertake it, in our experience, under the umbrella and with the help of community-based financing and a community-based development corporation that uses their skills in building and maybe marketing new development, but keeps them from undertaking the significant risk that they really, as small businesses, can't afford to take on. We have a CHODO in Salina. It was organized several years ago, but it really doesn't and never has operated very effectively. That is a fundamental problem in getting the process of housing going in Salina. And I would say that given the array of developers and builders and financiers and so forth, that there is the nucleus of a partnership. We found financial institutions who are very interested in community reinvestment and redevelopment. We found builders who actually are interested in it as well, but don't believe that they can take the personal risk to bring that about. And we have found in the community structure as well a real interest in moving forward in neighborhood reinvestment, but just the ingredients and the spirit is there in place, but we don't have the mechanism with the experience and the organizational dynamic to make it happen, and that's something that we feel will be very important to develop if we're really serious about neighborhood reinvestment. So we've got a market that is poised for development. we've got developers who do, in terms of building for moderate income or middle cost housing, who need the incentive, shall we say, or at least the cushion of public financing for that element of housing development, which is not very profitable. And we have a need for a very deep and patient approach that's focused on the redevelopment of specific areas of the city. And if we can put those elements in place and have a policy that addresses all of these needs and all of these possibilities, then we think that we can solve or be on the way to solving our housing challenges. So we are going to talk about several points in this process. And point number one really involves resolving the issue of urban growth, of greenfield versus infill development. And to that we say, with all our energy, that it is not a versus proposition, it is an and proposition. It is greenfield, or shall we say contiguous greenfield and infill development. That is the way that we achieve a healthy development market. And again, understanding the issues becomes very important. We did, and you may or may not, yeah, yes, you can see it. We did a comparison of private financing of a house using privately financed infrastructure and financing infrastructure through special assessments, and what the implications are to an individual home buyer. You find several things. Number one, the cost to the home buyer is almost exactly, the cost from a monthly perspective is almost exactly the same. So to say that special assessments make housing cheaper really isn't true. It's marginally cheaper, but not significantly less expensive. Once you put on the cost of specials on top of regular debt service and principal and insurance and utilities and all those kinds of things, that the monthly costs are really not significantly different. However, what is significant about special assessments is a sharing of risk. And I know that we think that developers developing subdivisions are making a profit on subdivision lots. By and large, they really aren't. It's not a very profitable proposition. Once you factor in holding costs, the capital costs of buying land, and the capital cost of public improvements to develop that land. If we use an exclusively privately financed regime, we are putting that risk and the entirely on the private developer, and the private developer, being relatively averse to that risk, is going to tend not to develop those lots. So that's where we've been under the moratorium on special assessments in Salina, is really in kind of a stasis, kind of a situation where we're not getting lots developed, and we're not getting homes developed, and getting dangerously low on land supply. You could say that, well, the developers will build their homes and have a need to do that, so they will now find lots in existing parts of the city and build in infill situations. And yet they don't do that. And again, there are several reasons that they don't. One is that typically the typical challenges to infill development are going to be the lack of big areas that are contiguous, of being able to build enough houses in one place and to be able to control that property so that there is a big enough critical mass that a neighborhood is built. We just don't have that kind of area right now without significant public intervention. We have somewhat scattered ownership. Private developers don't have the power of eminent domain. We have floodplain issues. We have neighborhood issues as well. And these things all complicate the ability of a conventional private builder to move in by himself or herself and get this job done. So ultimately, when we think about our strategic approach, once again, we need to address the growth policy and the development financing issue. We need to have an effective housing development structure that can meet those housing needs that the private sector will not by itself satisfy because it can't do it. We need to establish a program that in a very systematic way and in a patient way increases the value of undervalued neighborhoods like North Salina. And we have to do some pilot stuff. We need to show some results on the ground that really ultimately get the ball rolling. And so that's going to be a lot of the focus of our discussion from now to the end of our time together. Comments on that? And I don't know that everybody will agree with it, but having been in this business now for 40 long years in one way or another, from my halcyon days as a 25-year-old planning intern to a 65-year-old active senior. Okay, so let's move forward a bit. We have really tried to think through this issue of policy related to development financing carefully, and believe that there are 4 specific areas to think about in terms of public policy. The first of those is that identify objectives that we have gleaned from our work in Salina, and that we have also gleaned from your previous work on the comprehensive plan. One of those is the price of housing, whether it's owner-occupied or renter-occupied housing, the price points. That generally, houses over $250,000 and up, and there are some in Salina, can pretty much take care of themselves. That things like infrastructure are a relatively minor part of the cost of those houses. And so private financing really does make sense, at least from an economic point of view, although there might be some other reasons that we want to offer an incentive. The middle cost housing that are in the $175,000 to $250,000 range, or the market rate rental, represent about 20% of our demand for housing. They in current dollars represent a significant element of housing growth. In general, builders can deliver with ease housing within this range, but in a lot of cases, again, even though these seem to be relatively high-valued houses, the marginal risk of infrastructure and of lot development can be a disincentive to providing the lots on the ground that satisfy this demand. So we're beginning now to get into the range where special assessments have value. Doesn't have to be 100% special assessment, but some public and private combination and sharing of risk has value. When we get into the next level, the moderate cost, $125,000 to $175,000, or the lower end of market rate rentals, infrastructure finance on a public basis becomes just fundamentally important to be able to allow builders to develop units in that range. And then we get into the lower cost ranges where we're looking at redevelopment or at lower cost housing. We need deeper forms of subsidization to be able to get there. So one level of public policy consideration deals with the need-related price of housing and the ability of private builders to deliver houses within those ranges. At the higher end, it can be completely private. At the lower end, the private sector really becomes more of an agency rather than a profit maker. And in the middle, some more medium level of assistance or risk sharing becomes important. The second issue is contiguity. The last thing that we want in Salina is for people to particularly higher end development, to start going off into the country outside of the city limits and taking the city's tax base with it. We don't. That would be a very bad outcome to happen. Development that is non-contiguous, that involves leapfrog areas, is also expensive because it either is beyond the reach of city utilities or requires utility extensions that have to skip over vacant property and create a lot of financing difficulties. So sound growth that's contiguous to existing growth is a positive value. A third policy direction or imperative involves design innovation, introducing housing components that are very important and very useful and more sustainable, but are not necessarily what people are used to building. So we in Salina have generally delivered single-family houses on moderate to large lots, single-family detached houses on moderate to large lots, and there's a demonstrated market for that. But there are other forms of urban housing that are marketable as well, particularly with new generations. People don't necessarily believe that because it's untested. These are small lot, single-family developments, attached houses or attached housing units in various forms that we just don't have a lot of experience with. So there's doubt about whether they will sell, but the market experience in other places indicates that they will. Well, think about lots that are producing densities in a range of 6 to 8 units per acre. So we're talking here now about 5,000-6,000 square foot lots for single family. Again, these are not things for everybody, but they do work for particularly millennial markets as an equity alternative. That involve townhouses, owner-occupied townhouses that may achieve densities in the range of 8 to 12 units per acre. These are densities that are well above the 2.5 to 3 units per acre that are typical of single-family development in Salina. So we're not saying that these are what you must build, but this kind of higher density housing in urban settings and in areas around and near downtown is a positive value that should be rewarded and encouraged by city policy, whether that's zoning policy or development assistance policy. So again, these are not exclusive categories, but they're things that are positive values. We'd like to see affordable housing built, so policy should move in that direction. We would like to see new development take place at any price that's contiguous to or in reinvestment areas. That's a positive thing. We would like to see a more diverse housing stock that isn't just a single type of construction, but rather satisfies a number of different markets. Build on a trial basis first, but testing reception by the market. And the final one is reinvestment in redevelopment areas that is the most difficult of all, that also specifically should be rewarded and encouraged. So when we think about things like development financing and how that should work, all of those things are taken into consideration. So we might, if we have a high-end development of units over $250,000, for example, but those are built in settings that are directly contiguous to the existing city, as opposed to being out somewhere in the country, or are projects that are built in areas where we want to sustain and increase property values. Those are deserving of an incentive, even though they may not need that incentive in order to deliver lots. If you're building, so what does that mean? If you're building an expensive subdivision a mile outside of development, you're on your own. If you're building it adjacent to the city that's taking advantage of existing infrastructure as primarily to the revenue advantage of the city because the public costs are very low, maybe a little bit of risk sharing in infrastructure might be warranted. If you're building in the middle of a reinvestment area, then we're going to make it really pleasant for you and try to ameliorate the risk as much as possible. So again, when we think about development policy, it's not yes or no, it's nuanced. It's how is that project meeting identified positive public policy imperatives? And so what we've set forth in the document, and I don't want to go into it in detail because it'll bore you to death, and you may, and is a model for how to evaluate individual development proposals based on price point, on contiguity, on location and adjacency to existing infrastructure, on innovation, and on and density, and on presence in reinvestment areas that can help develop a response and an objective response to whether that project's infrastructure is going to be totally privately financed, totally publicly financed, or some share of the two. That's kind of the philosophy of it. And how that sorts out in terms of is shown in this matrix. That would be a rental range for a developer building in that range, and not renting a house in that range. So generally, if you were to build a house in that range, you would be in about $1,000 to $1,200 a month rent range. We're using this as sort of a medium level rent, given the rental categories in Salina. Yeah, closer to $1 a square foot. So this is so if you're to carry these through, let's say you're proposing in this model, if you're proposing a subdivision that's typically going to be it's going to be lots of a size and a price that are going to generate houses that are in $175,000 to $250,000 range. If those are justified solely on price point, but are separated from the city, then a 50-50 special assessment to private development cost might be a consideration as a model for that. If that development is fully contiguous, basically it's just a short hookup onto existing infrastructure, then a full special assessment would provide an incentive, a reward, a risk-sharing reward for that kind of contiguous development. If you were if you were if you were basing it on density, then it would also be a full special assessment if mixed with, if it were a mixed development with other prices. And if it were in a reinvestment area, we would propose doing a lot of things, including tax increment financing or RHIDs, rural housing investment, or rural housing incentive districts, to take that load of infrastructure finance off both the private developer and the individual home buyer. So that becomes a much deeper subsidy to get that kind of a housing unit built in the reinvestment area. So it starts out, if it's only building in that price point, at that price point, then it's reasonable to have some sort of risk-sharing arrangement, and the subsidy or the assistance level becomes deeper as we go down the line. Now again, this is not saying that this is the absolute best formulation of this, but it's a philosophy and a basis that we can then use to develop a policy that kind of puts our cards on the table at the front end, and has increasing levels of assistance, from nothing to partial to full special assessments to deeper subsidies, depending upon the context that we're building in. Yes, John.
Just a comment too, and maybe a clarification if you can provide it for the price point alone. I mean, would that include leapfrog development?
Yeah.
Okay, because we already have existing policy that says if you are not already contiguous, then you're not eligible. So would you say that we ought to change
We would agree with
policy and
that.
make those eligible?
No, we would agree with that.
Okay, because I mean,
Yeah.
the one is 50-50.
Yeah.
And right now, we're 0 eligible.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So what am I missing on that?
I would say you're not missing anything. We should probably change. I mean, again, that's why we would fine tune the idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay. That's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. We don't want leapfrog. We don't. Generally, special assessment should not be used for leapfrog development.
Or one might argue any of the other types of incentives or any of those others.
Right. Yeah. You could. There may be a situation.
Unless there's a really good reason.
Unless there's a really good reason to do it. Right.
And it'd be nice to see what some of those might be too.
Yeah.
A similar note
Yeah.
into that. So.
I would say, Marty, here though, we are saying that if it meets that price point of the 175 or so, and it is contiguous, that's more where the 50-50
That's
piece
right.
is coming
Yeah.
from.
Yeah. That's right.
That, because that's a price point.
Well, that's what I thought you were saying earlier.
Yeah.
Right. So if it is contiguous and it's in that price point, there might be some 50-50 on the
Yeah,
stuff.
I think that's a good point, that this probably wants to move down into that range.
And there's another table too that we even have copies of that might goes into a little more detail. This one.
That one.
Yeah, and we have some paper copies of
Yeah.
it too.
Yeah.
And that one talks a little bit more about specific types of units that you might see in those ranges and so forth.
So a policy framework a policy framework that responds to those things is something that we would consider to be an important element of our overall strategy. Point 2 involves creating a housing delivery structure that fills these market gaps, that can go into reinvestment neighborhoods now and get the job done. Generally, that will involve a combination of 2 things. One is at least at this stage, a nonprofit, community-based developer that should operate like a private developer and may involve, and probably would in Salina, involve a partnership with private builders and developers that has the expertise to be able to get projects done, and a financial mechanism, namely something like a lenders consortium, that can provide financing to get that to provide the seed capital necessary to make those types of projects happen. In the document, we use the example of Des Moines. Des Moines, Iowa has for a number of years had a very effective structure for neighborhood development. It has included a nonprofit developer, the Neighborhood Development Corporation, that by now has developed hundreds and maybe thousands of units of housing, but also has the ability to do commercial projects. And they have done some very successful things and really rebuilt neighborhoods in the city. And an entity called Neighborhood Finance Corporation. This is a component that is funded by bond funds, actually from the city of Des Moines. It also uses corporate contributions and investments and risk capital through a variety of lending institutions. And it provides the NDC and other developers as well with a source of capital that involves, again, not piling the risk onto any one institution, but sharing risk and involving public financing as well. But those two components of an effective development corporation that actually has the expertise to get projects done, which gets a little bit deeper than just people who are volunteering who have good hearts, but involves significant expertise in marketing and a financing agency that can provide the capital as well.